She stepped onto the stage with quiet footsteps, her white cane tapping gently across the polished wood floor. Her hair was tied back in a simple braid, her clothes were plain, and her eyes remained fixed somewhere distant, unseeing but calm. The whispers began immediately. Parents, teachers, and students seated in the auditorium exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others skeptical. She was too young, too shy, too disabled. A girl like her had no place on a stage like this, they thought. It was the annual talent showcase at North Glen Preparatory School, a prestigious institution known for its elite programs and accomplished students. Most of the performers came from privileged homes, trained for years in music, dance, and theater. She was not one of them. Her name was Lena Darrow. She had been blind since birth, and today, without any fanfare, she was expected to play a piano piece in front of an audience that had already decided she would fail. Earlier that day, she had overheard the laughter in the hallway, the sarcastic bets placed by classmates on how many notes she would miss. The cruelest among them had even approached the music teacher with a suggestion to cancel her slot, claiming it was unfair to expect the audience to endure a performance from someone who could not even see the keys. But the teacher, Mr. Hallberg, had refused. Lena had insisted on playing. She had practiced for months, sometimes early in the morning when no one was around, her fingers memorizing the feel of every octave, every chord, every silent vibration in the air. She did not need to see the keys. She had learned to hear them. Still, the crowd was unconvinced. Some leaned back in their seats, expecting a cringe-worthy few minutes followed by a merciful applause. Others leaned forward, not with curiosity, but with anticipation of failure. In the back row, a group of students stifled laughter. On stage, Lena took a breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys. The room had fallen so silent that the slightest shift of the bench seemed loud. She began to play. At first it was simple, a single melody line, clear and steady. Then her left hand joined, filling the space with harmony, rich and layered. The notes poured out like water from a spring, precise yet emotive, delicate but commanding. The same crowd that had been ready to dismiss her now froze. Jaws slackened. The snickering stopped. A hush spread across the room, heavy and complete. Every note Lena played seemed to carry the weight of everything she had endured, every moment of being overlooked, every name she had been called, every time someone had spoken over her. Her blindness did not hinder her. It elevated her. She was not reading music, not following any visual cues. She was creating something that came from a place deeper than sight. Her playing was intuitive, emotional, and utterly transcendent. Even Mr. Hallberg, who had supported her, looked stunned. In all his years teaching music, he had never heard a student deliver a piece with such maturity and control. Lena's song was not a performance. It was a statement. Every finger movement, every change in tempo, every shift in dynamic spoke volumes. It was not just about the music. It was about reclaiming space in a room that had already written her off. The grand piano on stage was no longer a prop for mockery. It had become a vessel for truth. Parents leaned forward now with teary eyes. Students who had scoffed began exchanging silent glances of disbelief. Even the principal, who had barely glanced at her application for the showcase, looked down in embarrassment. The truth was sinking in. They had not just underestimated her. They had never even tried to see her. But Lena did not seek their approval. She kept playing, eyes still fixed ahead, a soft smile barely forming at the edges of her lips. She played not to impress them, but because this was her language. A language she had been fluent in since she was 6 years old, sitting at a dusty, upright piano in the corner of her grandmother's kitchen. She had learned by feel, by listening, by trusting something other than her sight. And now, in front of the very people who had doubted her most, she was telling a story they could not ignore. The final note lingered in the air longer than anyone expected, as if time itself had stopped to listen. Then, silence. A beat. Then another. And then the entire auditorium erupted. Applause thundered through the room, rising to a standing ovation. Lena stood, bowed slightly, and walked off the stage as quietly as she had entered. Behind the curtain, Lena stood still, gripping the edge of the heavy fabric to steady herself. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly from the adrenaline. She could hear the applause still echoing behind her, but she had already begun retreating inward, as if closing a door to the noise and returning to the quiet world she knew best. She did not perform for praise. She had performed for her own truth. But in the wings, a voice stopped her. It was Caroline Dean, the head organizer of the event, known for her sharp critiques and sharper tongue. Everyone feared her judgment, which often came without filter or mercy. "Lena," she said with a tone neither kind nor cruel, just surprised. "That was unexpected." A pause. "You played that Chopinitude?" Lena nodded. "By ear," she said softly. Caroline blinked. "That piece takes professionals years to master." Her voice faltered for a moment. "And you memorized it by sound?" Lena tilted her head. "I learned it by listening, and by feeling it." There was no arrogance in her tone, just fact. Caroline stepped back, and for once she had no immediate critique, just silence. A few other faculty members approached her then, offering scattered praise, but Lena excused herself politely. She did not need their validation. Outside the auditorium, students lingered in groups, buzzing with a new kind of energy. Some stared at her as she walked by, not with pity this time, but with awe. One girl whispered something, and her friend nodded, glancing toward Lena with wide eyes. A boy who had once mocked her in the lunchroom muttered, "Sorry," under his breath as she passed. It was a strange thing, the way people changed once they were forced to confront something that did not fit into their assumptions. Lena kept walking. She preferred the silence anyway. In the parking lot, her older brother Jonah waited beside their family's worn-out sedan. He opened the passenger door and guided her in gently. He had been her first audience, her biggest supporter, and the one person who had never underestimated her. "You did it," he said simply as he buckled his seatbelt. "I did," Lena whispered. Then she smiled, not because of the applause, not because of the shocked faces, but because she had played exactly how she had wanted to play, and no one could take that away from her. The next morning, the video was everywhere. Someone had recorded her performance from the front row and uploaded it online. By the time Lena arrived at school, the clip had been shared by thousands. Teachers she had never spoken to before greeted her in the hallway. Students who had never remembered her name now said it with admiration. But fame was never her goal. That morning, all Lena wanted was to get to the music room before first bell. She had permission to use the grand piano during her free periods, and she needed the quiet. When she reached the door, however, it was already open. Inside stood Julian Reed, one of the most celebrated student pianists in the state, known for his precision and his powerful interpretations. He had won every competition he entered and was often described as a prodigy. Lena had never spoken to him. He had always seemed untouchable. But now, here he was, standing beside the piano, watching her. "You are Lena," he said, his voice neutral but focused. "Yes," she replied cautiously. "I am Julian," he continued, though she already knew. "I watched your performance 3 times last night." Lena was silent. "I thought I was the best pianist in this school," he said. "Maybe even the city. But I do not know if I could have played what you played, the way you played it." His voice had no bitterness, only truth. "How long have you been learning?" Lena shrugged. "Since I was 6. Julian stepped aside and gestured to the piano bench. "Play something. Anything." Lena hesitated, then walked over, sat down, and placed her hands on the keys. She began a soft improvisation, a piece she made up on the spot, drifting between minor and major themes, letting her fingers guide her. When she stopped, Julian let out a breath. "You do not play like someone blind," he said. Lena smiled faintly. "What does someone blind play like?" He laughed, caught. "Fair point." Then, after a pause, "Would you be willing to practice with me? Maybe collaborate?" Lena turned her head toward him, surprised. "Why?" "Because," he said seriously, "you make me want to be better, and not just technically, emotionally." There was a long pause. Then she nodded. "All right." That moment, quiet and without fanfare, marked the beginning of something bigger than either of them realized. Word spread quickly. Soon, the school was buzzing again, this time about the possibility of a duet between the two piano talents. one who had always been expected to succeed, and one who had shocked everyone just by showing up. But Lena still walked the halls with her head down, her cane clicking softly on the tiles. She had never needed the spotlight. What she needed was the music, and the space to play it on her own terms. Still, deep inside, she knew something had shifted, not just in how people saw her, but in how she saw herself. The school's annual spring gala was a month away, and this year it was being held off campus for the first time in the history of North Glen. It would take place at the city's historic Lyric Hall, a venue known for hosting orchestras, operas, and artists of national acclaim. The principal, faculty, and organizing committee had decided this year's theme would be Unseen Brilliance. The irony was not lost on Lena when she heard it. At first, she did not plan to participate again. One performance had been enough. She had made her point, shattered their assumptions, and walked away with her dignity. But then Mr. Halberg approached her after class. He told her they were extending the final act of the gala to feature a special collaboration. Julian Reed had requested her specifically. Lena was hesitant. She enjoyed the privacy of her music. It was never meant for performance or attention. But there was something sincere about Julian's request. He was not asking to share the spotlight, he was offering to learn alongside her, and something inside her softened. She agreed. Over the next few weeks, the two practiced daily, not in front of others, but in the old music room that echoed slightly more than the new one. Julian brought his technical mastery, Lena brought her emotional depth, and together they composed an original piece. It was part classical, part improvisation, and fully theirs. They did not speak much during practice, they listened. Sometimes Julian would stop playing just to hear how Lena interpreted a melody, and sometimes Lena would ask him to describe the expressions on the faces of people in the audience during a certain passage. It was a partnership built not on competition, but respect. Slowly, word spread about what they were preparing. Students tried to sneak in to catch glimpses of the rehearsals, but they were always turned away. The mystery only grew. People whispered about how the blind girl and the prodigy had somehow formed a musical alliance that defied logic. The performance quickly became the most anticipated part of the gala. Meanwhile, Lena remained unchanged. She still wore her plain shoes, still walked to class with her cane, still sat in the cafeteria alone by choice. But people watched her differently now, not with pity, not with curiosity, but with something closer to reverence. The same teachers who once forgot her name now sought her input in class. The students who had mocked her now stepped aside to let her pass. Even Caroline Dean had gone quiet, as if unsure how to position herself around someone she had once dismissed. But Lena did not gloat. She did not seek their attention. She carried herself with the same stillness she always had, rooted in who she was, not in how others saw her. And quietly, beneath that still surface, something had started to grow. Not pride, but confidence. Not arrogance, but recognition. That her presence in a room could not be ignored anymore, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. The night of the gala arrived with a hush of spring rain and the hum of conversation. Lyric Hall was lit with soft gold chandeliers, and velvet curtains framed the grand stage. Families in tailored suits and elegant dresses filled the rows, programs in hand, smiles practiced. But even amidst the polished social rituals, there was a distinct buzz surrounding the final act. Julian Reed and Lena Darrow. Their names were printed in bold at the end of the lineup, followed by the words, "Original Composition." The other performers were excellent, the dancers flawless, the singers powerful, the instrumentalists refined. But each act seemed to exist as a warm-up for what was to come. Backstage, Lena sat quietly on a bench, her fingers lightly grazing the edge of the piano keys just once before pulling away. She wore a deep blue dress, not extravagant, just flowing and clean, chosen by her grandmother and altered by hand to fit her just right. Her braid had been redone by her neighbor earlier that day. Nothing flashy, just Lena, exactly as she wanted to be. Julian stood a few feet away, adjusting his cuffs with more nervous energy than usual. For all his competitions and applause, he had never felt quite like this. Not anxious, just aware. Aware that this performance was not about winning or showcasing, it was about honoring the kind of music that did not need to shout to be heard. When the curtain rose, the hall fell into complete silence. Julian walked out first, bowed slightly, and sat at the left half of the bench. Lena followed, guided gently by one of the stage assistants, and took her seat on the right. Together they began to play. There were no theatrics, no dramatic gestures, just sound, pure, intentional sound. The piece moved like breath, soft and steady, then rising, then falling again. Julian introduced the themes with precision. Lena echoed and transformed them with feeling. Sometimes they switched, sometimes they blended. There were moments when their hands moved so closely, it looked like a single artist performing. And yet, you could always tell where Julian's control ended and Lena's emotion began. They were two voices in conversation, two perspectives meeting in the language of melody. At one point, Lena took a brief solo, a wandering, almost whispered sequence that made the audience lean forward, holding their breath. It was not loud. It was not fast. It was simply real. She played as if speaking directly to the soul of each listener, and then Julian joined again, supporting her, not overtaking her. It was a masterclass in collaboration and in humility. As the final notes faded, the hall remained silent, not because they were unsure, but because they did not want to break the spell. And when the applause finally came, it did not crash. It swelled, like gratitude, like awe. Lena stood slowly. She did not bow deeply, just nodded once and turned. Julian did the same. They walked off stage side by side, neither leading the other. And in that quiet departure, they made their final statement, that brilliance does not announce itself. It just plays. Outside the hall, the night air was cool and damp with rain, but no one seemed eager to go home. Parents spoke in hushed voices, teachers wiped their eyes, students clustered in quiet groups, replaying the last performance over and over in words that failed to capture it. Inside the venue, Lena and Julian stood near the dressing rooms, their clothes slightly wrinkled from sitting, but their spirits still caught in the music. Julian looked at her and said softly, "I have never played like that before." Lena smiled. "Neither have I." It was not a compliment. It was a confession. Moments later, the school principal found them and insisted they return to the stage. There was a plaque, a speech, even a check for a small scholarship, hastily arranged once the crowd had made clear how deeply they had been moved. Lena accepted the gesture with quiet grace, but she knew this was never about trophies or scholarships. She did not play to impress. She played because the music allowed her to say things no one had ever given her the space to say aloud. And now, suddenly, everyone was listening. The following week brought an unexpected shift. Local news outlets began reaching out. A regional radio station requested an interview. A short article in the city paper called her the girl who played from the soul. One teacher even suggested nominating her for a National Youth Arts Fellowship. But Lena was not interested in attention. What moved her was not recognition, but change. A few days later, she asked Mr. Hallberg if she could start a new program through the school. Something small, a music workshop for children with disabilities. Not a charity, not a showcase, just a space. A place where children who had been silenced by assumptions could learn to speak through sound. Hallberg agreed immediately, and so it began. Every Friday afternoon, Lena stayed after school and taught basic piano to a small group of students. Some were blind, some had hearing challenges, others struggled with speech or mobility. None of them had been expected to participate in anything outside their special education curriculum. But in Lena's workshop, none of that mattered. There were no auditions, no spotlights, just hands-on keys, ears wide open, and a quiet encouragement that told each child, "You belong here." She taught them the way she had taught herself, by feel, by listening, by letting the music carry what words could not. And slowly, something remarkable began to happen. Students who had never spoken in class started humming melodies. Children who had been kept at the margins began asking for extra practice time. The classroom changed, and with it, so did the school. Lena had not just performed at a gala. She had opened a door, and others were beginning to walk through it. Not everyone welcomed the change. Some parents questioned why so much attention was being given to students who would never become concert musicians. One faculty member even muttered that Lena's program was a distraction from serious instruction. And a few students, still clinging to old hierarchies, rolled their eyes whenever Lena's name was mentioned. but their voices were no longer the loudest in the room. Because the difference Lena had made was visible now, not just in performances or accolades, but in the quiet transformation of the school culture. Students had started showing up early to volunteer with her workshop. The music room was no longer an exclusive space for the elite. It had become something softer, more open, more honest. And somewhere along the way, Julian had become one of the most committed volunteers. He showed up every Friday, no matter how many recitals or lessons he had. Sometimes he played with the students, sometimes he just listened, and sometimes he let them teach him. One afternoon, after the last child had packed up their things and the lights had dimmed, Julian sat beside Lena on the bench and said, "This is what music is supposed to be." Lena nodded. Not performance, connection. She had said it quietly, but the truth of it settled into the air like a song. Months passed, the seasons changed, the city moved on to other news, and Lena was no longer the trending name on the local arts calendar. But her workshop remained, the students kept coming, the music kept growing, and then one day, something unexpected happened. Julian walked into the music room with a letter in his hand and a stunned expression on his face. "It is from the conservatory," he said. "The national program." Lena tilted her head. "You applied?" He shook his head. "Number." They reached out. "Someone sent them the video of our performance." He paused. "They want to offer me a spot." Lena smiled. "That is incredible." But Julian did not smile. He looked at the letter, then back at her. "I do not want to go without you." "Julian," she began, but he interrupted her. "No, listen. They want to interview me next month. I spoke to the director. I asked if they would consider a co-applicant, a collaborative entry. I sent them the piece we wrote. I explained how we work." Lena said nothing. Julian's voice was steady now. "They said yes, if you are willing, if you want to try." Lena sat in silence. Her hands rested on the keys. She did not need sight to see what he was offering. Not a shortcut, not a gift, a door. She took a breath, held it, then let it out. "All right," she said. "Let us try." And with that, the next chapter began. The interview day arrived on a quiet morning filled with sunlight and nerves. The conservatory's regional center was located in a stone building downtown, wrapped in ivy and humming with decades of musical history. Students who walked those halls went on to become composers, performers, professors. It was the kind of place Lena had only heard about from teachers and guest musicians, always spoken of with the kind of reverence reserved for sacred spaces. But she did not tremble as she stepped inside. Julian walked beside her, and together they made their way to the small performance room where the panel waited. There were no grand lights, no stage curtains, only a piano, a few chairs, and 3 judges who held clipboards but wore kind expressions. The director introduced himself first and explained that this interview was not just about musical skill, it was about understanding, depth, and vision. Lena nodded. Julian adjusted his jacket. Then they sat, took a breath, and began to play. They did not choose something familiar. They played the piece they had written together, the same one that had carried the gala to silence and then to standing applause. But this time, it was different, more restrained, more inward. Lena could feel the difference in Julian's tempo, in the way he responded to her phrasing without needing cues, and she played with a new certainty, not of being accepted, but of having nothing to prove. When they finished, the room was silent. Again, the director leaned forward and asked Lena how she had learned to play without sight. She answered simply, "I learned to listen." Another judge asked what music meant to her. Lena replied, "It is how I speak when I am not being listened to." Julian remained silent through most of it, offering only one sentence at the end. "She taught me how to hear." When the interview concluded, they thanked the panel and stepped back into the hallway. No declarations were made, no handshakes promising a future, but they both felt something had changed. Not just in the way they were seen, but in how they saw themselves. The results would take weeks, they were told. Still, Lena felt no rush. She had already passed the test that mattered. Not in that room, but the moment she decided to walk into it. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. Lena continued teaching her Friday workshop. Julian returned to his lessons. But something quiet had settled between them, a shared sense that whatever came next would come together. They no longer practiced for perfection. They played to stay connected. And that was enough. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, a package arrived. It was thin, official-looking, and addressed to both Lena and Julian. They opened it together in the music room. Inside was a single page, an offer of admission, not to the standard program, but to a newly created two-person track in the conservatory's collaboration department. A note at the bottom read, "We have never done this before, but some doors should open even if they were never designed to." Lena touched the raised lettering on the page, her fingers lingering for a moment. She smiled. Julian exhaled for the first time in what felt like days. That weekend, a small celebration was held in the school's garden. Nothing extravagant, just students from the workshop, their families, a few faculty members, and the soft hum of music played through a modest speaker. Mr. Halberg gave a speech, short and warm. Julian's parents brought cookies. Lena's grandmother wore her best shawl and cried through the entire afternoon. But Lena herself stood quietly near the piano, her cane resting against a bench, listening to the children from her workshop take turns playing little songs they had composed. Some hit the wrong notes, some forgot the endings. But Lena clapped after each one, because none of this was ever about perfection. It was about giving them what she had fought to claim for herself, a place to be heard. As the evening sun dipped behind the trees, Julian approached her and said, "You realize this is only the beginning?" She nodded. "That is what makes it so beautiful." They sat down together at the piano one more time, not for an audience, not for an application, but for each other. They played something they had never written down, something improvised, something free, and the children danced, and the parents smiled, and the music rose, not to impress, but to remind everyone there that brilliance lives in places most people never think to look, and sometimes all it takes is one quiet girl with a cane and a song to show them where to listen. The conservatory's spring showcase had ended hours ago, but Lena and Julian remained seated in the empty balcony of the grand hall. The crowd had left, the lights had dimmed, and the room had returned to stillness, but inside them, something had shifted again. Not dramatically, not like fireworks or thunderclaps, but like a door that had quietly opened farther than expected. The director had said their piece was not about display, it was about invitation. And she was right, because even now, as Lena sat with her shoes tucked under the seat, her cane resting beside her, and her hands folded in her lap, she could still feel the pulse of the piano beneath her skin. Julian sat with his back against the velvet railing, staring at the ceiling's ornate carvings. "We are not supposed to be here," he whispered. "And yet, we are." Lena turned her head toward him. "Maybe it is time we stopped thinking of it like that." He smiled. "You mean, stop being surprised?" "No," she said softly. "Never stop being surprised. Just stop acting like we do not belong in the surprise." The thought settled between them like a final note. Outside, the city moved on. Cars passed. Streetlights buzzed. But inside that room, they felt held. Julian eventually stood, stretched his arms, and offered his hand to Lena. She took it, rising slowly. They walked back through the corridors of the conservatory, not as students, not yet, but as something else. Witnesses, builders, maybe even architects of a different kind of space. Over the following weeks, invitations began arriving. A youth music conference in Vermont, a panel on accessibility in the arts, a community concert in Portland. Some invitations came with money attached, others with only goodwill. Lena accepted all the ones that involved children. She declined the ones that felt like token gestures. Julian followed her lead, not because she asked, but because somewhere along the way, her compass had become theirs. They traveled together that summer, holding small workshops and performing in school gyms and church basements and city libraries. Some pianos were out of tune, some audiences were tiny, some shows began late and ended in flickering fluorescent light, but they played anyway, and always someone listened. A child in the front row, a teacher with tears in her eyes, a parent too overwhelmed to clap. Every town left a mark, and Lena kept a journal of every song improvised in each place, each one named after the person who needed it most. She called it her quiet anthology. In late August, as the leaves began to yellow at the edges, the conservatory semester finally began. They moved into a shared student apartment, separate bedrooms, one upright piano, a modest kitchen, and a living room filled with handwritten sheet music and tea mugs and headphones tangled in every drawer. It was not glamorous, but it was theirs. And for the first time in Lena's life, she felt like she had been built for the life she was stepping into, not just welcomed, designed for it. The classes were difficult, full of intense theory and long critique sessions, and students who could play entire symphonies from memory. Some of them had parents in symphonies or siblings in conservatories across the ocean. Lena had none of that, but she had her hands, she had her ears. She had Julian, who still watched her hands during practice like he was learning a new language each time. And slowly, the other students began to notice. At first, she was known as the blind girl who played by ear, then as the one who could improvise in any key, then as the one who taught Saturday workshops for kids from the city's underserved districts. One student, Viola, a violinist from Oregon, asked if she could help. Then another. Then another. And by winter, Lena and Julian were running an off-campus youth program with 9 volunteers, 3 faculty advisors, and funding from 2 donors who had attended their Vermont concert that summer. The apartment became a planning space, a rehearsal hub, a safe haven. It was messy and crowded and filled with noise, but it was joyful. On the night of the first winter recital, Lena stood in the wings of the small city theater they had rented for the youth ensemble. She could hear the children tuning their instruments, whispering nervously, laughing too loudly. Julian came up beside her. "Do you remember the first time you played in front of an audience?" She nodded. "North Glen. I wore the same shoes I wear now." Julian chuckled. "You still have them?" "They remind me," she said. "Of what?" "Of the girl who played for herself, not for them." He paused. "And who do you play for now?" She turned her face slightly, smiling. "For the ones who think they do not belong. For the ones still sitting in the audience, waiting for someone to make space." The curtain rose. The children walked out. Lena stayed behind, hand resting lightly on the backstage railing, listening not to correct, but to believe. The music was not perfect. Notes were missed, tempos wobbled, but it was real. And the applause was not loud because the audience was impressed. It was loud because they saw the effort. They saw the joy. And joy, when witnessed, becomes contagious. Afterward, as coats were gathered and instruments zipped into cases, one of the youngest students, a girl named Zara with thick glasses and a voice barely above a whisper, ran up to Lena. "I want to be like you," she said. "You already are," Lena replied. The girl beamed. "No," she said. "I mean, I want to teach. I want to help others the way you helped me." Lena crouched down. "Then I will help you help others." Zara nodded like it was the easiest promise in the world. Because for her, maybe it was. That night, Lena returned home to the small apartment, kicked off her old shoes, made a cup of tea, and sat at the piano. She did not plan what she would play. She just let her hands move. It was a slow piece, gentle, unresolved, the kind of melody that left a question hanging in the air. Because her story was not done, not even close. She played until the cup went cold and the hallway outside went quiet. Then she smiled, because she knew that somewhere, someone was listening. Spring arrived slowly that year, with gray skies that stretched longer than usual and winds that blew blossoms across the pavement like scattered thoughts. Lena's calendar was now packed. There were ensemble meetings, mentorship sessions, outreach lessons, and a new request to contribute a composition to the conservatory's annual recording. But none of it felt like pressure. It felt like purpose. Julian thrived alongside her. His style, once rigid and brilliant, had softened into something more fluid, still precise, but no longer afraid of silence. Their friendship had grown past notes and measures. They finished each other's melodic phrases. They argued sometimes, especially over phrasing or rhythm, but it never lasted. Each disagreement made the music stronger. One day, Lena received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, addressed in blocky letters with no return address. She opened it and read the words slowly. It was from a former classmate at North Glen. a girl who had once laughed during Lena's first performance. The letter apologized sincerely and without excuse. It ended with, "I showed your video to my younger sister. She is learning piano now. She wants to be like you." Lena read it twice, then tucked it in her journal. She did not need an apology, but the truth that she had become someone's starting point. It settled in her chest like a soft chord. That same week, she was invited to return to North Glen as a guest speaker. The new principal had heard about the workshop program, seen the press, and asked if Lena might speak at an assembly about resilience and the power of music. At first, she hesitated. That auditorium still lived in her memory. The snickers, the dismissals, the sting of being ignored. But eventually, she said yes, not for closure, not for pride, but because someone else would be in that crowd holding back their voice, and they deserved to hear what Lena never did. When she arrived at North Glen, the building seemed smaller than she remembered. The walls no longer intimidated her. She walked through the halls without her cane this time, her hand grazing the lockers out of habit rather than need. Julian joined her, though he stayed behind the scenes. This was her stage now. The students filed into the auditorium, their faces curious, their phones ready to record. Lena took the microphone calmly, standing beneath the same lights that once seemed so cold. Her voice did not tremble. She did not tell them about awards or conservatories. She told them about being dismissed, about being underestimated, about learning to play in a kitchen because no one thought she should play in a school. And then she sat at the piano, not to perform, to speak. Her hands delivered a story the microphone never could. When she finished, the room stayed still. The applause was slower this time, more thoughtful. A few students stood. Most just watched. And in that silence, Lena smiled. Not because they clapped, but because this time they listened. After the assembly, one student approached her, a boy with hearing aids and a tremor in his hands. He said he played violin, badly, that he had stopped after being laughed at. Lena asked him if he remembered how it felt to hold the bow. He nodded. She told him that was all he needed to start again. He walked away with his shoulders taller. She returned to the conservatory that night feeling quieter than usual. Julian made tea while she sat at the piano bench. "How was it?" he asked. She answered with her hands, a slow progression, minor, tender. He listened, then joined her. They played for no one but themselves that night, and in doing so, they reminded each other why they began. By the end of that year, Lena's name had quietly become known far beyond the halls of the conservatory. Articles had been written, interviews aired, but what made the biggest difference was not her fame. It was her students. The ones who had attended her workshops were now starting their own small circles. One taught 3 siblings in her apartment complex. Another volunteered at a hospital, playing lullabies for children in recovery. One girl sent Lena a recording of her first full composition, shaky but full of wonder. Lena replied to every message, even the short ones. She called them echoes, evidence that the song never really ends. Julian began working with city schools to develop an arts inclusion policy. Lena published her anthology, The Sound of Belonging, as a printed collection, with every piece tied to a name and story. The proceeds went directly to funding new instruments for underserved programs. One evening, the conservatory hosted a tribute concert, not for faculty, not for donors, for Lena. She tried to decline, but the faculty insisted, so she accepted on one condition. It would not be about her. It would be about the children. That night, the hall filled with families from all across the state. Lena sat backstage while her students performed. Some missed notes, some rushed tempos, but every piece held something sacred: honesty. At the end, Lena walked on stage, not to play, but to thank them. And as she stood there, the girl who once walked into a school auditorium and was told she did not belong, the same girl who had been forced to perform as a joke, stood now as a builder of stages, of classrooms, of voices. She said only one thing: every time you choose to listen to someone others ignore, you are writing a new song. Then she walked off stage. Outside, the night was clear, stars overhead, the sound of laughter down the block. Julian caught up to her on the sidewalk. "Do you ever wonder," he said, "what would have happened if they never mocked you that day?" Lena paused. "I would have still played, but I might not have understood why." Julian nodded. And now, she smiled, now I play for the ones who have not yet been heard. She kept walking. The streetlights flickered above. In a nearby apartment, someone was practicing scales, and the world kept turning, quietly, tenderly, into a rhythm Lena understood not with her eyes, but with her hands, because brilliance does not always shout. Sometimes it simply plays, and those who are truly listening will hear it. If this story made you pause, made you feel something, or reminded you of someone who deserves to be heard, do not scroll just yet, because stories like Lena's are more than just entertainment. They are reminders of the quiet battles so many people fight every day. Maybe you were that kid who was overlooked, that teen told to sit quietly, that adult who still carries the weight of being doubted, or maybe you know someone like that. If so, we want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. Your words might give someone else the strength to keep going. If Lena's journey moved you, tap that like button. It lets us know you are listening, and it helps this story reach someone who needs it. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this, real ones, quiet ones, the kind that speak with honesty instead of noise, then subscribe, because here we are building a space for voices that once went unheard. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that brilliance is not about spotlight. It is about resilience, about showing up, and about daring to be heard.